Hello, everyone. We're going to get started in just about 2 minutes, and we'll be back with you. Thank you. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Ibrahim, and I am the program manager with the Cultural Investment Portfolio here at the Mass Cultural Council. The Cultural Investment Portfolio's focus is grants and services for nonprofit cultural organizations, and we're excited to have Michael back today for the second part of our conversation on operating in a changing world. This workshop is part of our Recover, Rebuild, and Renew efforts to help organizations come back from COVID-19. Now through the end of June, we'll be offering 2 free workshops every Tuesday and Thursday to assist organizations with the information they need to do so. As I said, joining us today is Michael Cass, a consultant from the Nonprofit Finance Fund. While we're going to start in just a few moments, I'd love to go over a few ground rules. If you want, you can say hi in the chat with your organization and just kind of give a wave there. That's lovely to know. Everybody sees each other. This session has automatic captioning. Auto-generated captions are available on all Mass Cultural Council Zoom meetings and webinars. If you do need any additional accommodations, just let us know when you register and we'd be happy to do that. We will have time for some questions and answers throughout the presentation. So if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function of Zoom, not the chat. We'll just keep it on the Q&A. That way we can keep it organized. This session is being recorded, as you can tell, and will be posted on the Mass Cultural Council YouTube channel probably tomorrow. You will get an email from me when that recording is available, but you can check the YouTube channel whenever you like. My colleague Cheyenne Cohn-Pastel is here, and she will be providing some resources in the chat box as we go along. This session is marked for an hour, including time for questions and answers. And with that, I'd love to turn it over to Michael.
Thank you so much, Michael. And hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Michael Cass. I'm a consultant with Nonprofit Finance Fund, and I'm also the founder of an independent consultancy called Story and Spirit, where I get to work with amazing people and organizations to help them harness the power of story to create change. And the reason I bring that up is part of what we're doing today is not just about budgeting and cash flow planning, although we'll certainly be covering some of that. It's also about really locating ourselves within the story of this moment. Where are we as organizations right now? And how can we find a way forward that really supports our missions? And how can we get the information we need to make the right decisions, no matter what scenario we may find ourselves in? Before we jump into today's content, as always in these webinars, we really find it important to start with acknowledging the history of the land that we're on. And it's always interesting to do this in virtual spaces because you and I, we're on different lands. I'm facilitating this from the unceded land that was stolen from the Apache and Pueblo peoples. Today, this land is known as Santa Fe, New Mexico. And what I'd invite you to do, if you would like to put it into the chat or simply acknowledge it to yourself, is acknowledge the indigenous territory you're joining us from. If you don't know, we have the website where you can find the nations that lived on the land, native-land.ca. Pentucket. Thank you, John. And there's a couple of reasons that doing these land acknowledgements is important. One is really simply to acknowledge the story that we're inside of and acknowledge the ancestral peoples of the lands that we're on. And the other is to create a little bit of spaciousness around our conversation, especially over the past year. So many of us have found ourselves in really reactive places that it can be impactful to begin by expanding our timeline a little bit. our missions are longer and deeper than the past year. And so, even though we may have been scrambling in reaction to the pandemic and other factors in the past year, going into the second year now, our missions will continue. And if we drill down deep enough, our missions are almost always about creating a more vibrant and equitable world. And acknowledging the history that we're inside of is an important part of that. Our agreements today, as much as possible, there's an invitation to share freely and candidly. If you have a response to something, put it in the chat. If a question comes up as we're going through the material, put it into the Q&A, like Michael said, and I've got the Q&A panel open. I guarantee you I will see it and I will get to it as soon as we can. I'd also like to say that every experience is valid. For some of us, our organizations may actually be thriving, and some of our organizations may be in a tough spot. There is no right or wrong way to be in relation to today's topic. We're all here as peers to learn from each other. And finally, take care of your needs first. I can't see you. If you need to get up and stretch, if you need to eat something or drink something, please feel free to do so. I feel like we spent so much time over the past year stuck in these little boxes that we sometimes forget to take care of ourselves. So just know there's an open invitation for that. If you're new to these webinars, a really brief introduction to Nonprofit Finance Fund. We were founded just about 40 years ago with a very specific mission, which was to help nonprofit organizations get financing for heating costs, like energy costs, and help them navigate how to pay for those, how to plan for those. Over time, organizations asked what the organization that has become NFF for help getting financing for other needs, and not just to get financing, but help around how to manage those finances appropriately, right? How to be really effective stewards of their mission and their organization. And so over the 40 years, our organization has grown really organically to still provide tailored investments and financing. We also offer strategic advice and accessible insights. We'll be offering some of those across the nonprofit sector in this country. And all of that is guided by the core values that you can see here. This is our team for the first 6 of these webinars. This is the 3rd one. We are halfway through. I'm Michael Cass. Christine Alvarez was here with us last week. I think, Christine, you're actually here as I may promote you to panelist in a little bit because I see you in the attendees. We also have Marissa Kubasek who will be joining us, and Robert Kagan, who will be facilitating our next webinar on budgeting in 2 weeks. Today, we're going to build on what Christine introduced last week. Last week, we really focused on what is the context of the nonprofit sector as a whole. And today, we're going to really drill down into where are we today? How has the past year impacted our organizations? And how can we navigate from the place that we find ourselves today? Specifically, we'll explore the impact that pandemic has had on the nonprofit sector in general, and specifically on cultural organizations. We're going to really deepen our understanding of capital structure and how it impacts our organization's futures. And then we'll learn to assess our organization's financial health and align decisions with real-time data. So we'll be looking at some concrete tools that you can use today if you aren't already, to get a pulse on where your organization is now so that you can be engaging in the right kinds of conversations planning for the future. Before we jump into the financials, because as we start to get into the specifics of where we are today and introduce these tools, it can get a little bit wonky and spreadsheety, which is great. And also, these conversations always take place within the context of humanity, within the context of the arts and culture. So I want to start by just acknowledging that the past year has taken a toll on all of us, on our businesses, on our mental well-being, on our physical well-being. There is no precedent for the situation we find ourselves in individually and organizationally. And because of that, there's no right way to feel or react, right? Even though we're talking about numbers, every financial decision we make has a human impact. It has a human impact on our teams, excuse me, and it has a human impact on the people that we serve as well. So in general, even though I tend to speak fast, there is an invitation in working our way through this material to slow down and really see how it applies to our situation and how it can impact the entire ecosystem of our organization. This information comes from a survey that NFF did just about a year ago in April 2020 and is updated throughout the year. But we asked, but I think it was 463 organizations, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected you? How have you been affected? And the information that we got back was that organizations almost across the board saw reduced funding from all sources, government, private, and earned. We had challenges with staff and volunteer availability. There was a reduced ability to provide essential services. We saw a lot of organizations, particularly arts and culture, canceling revenue generating programming. None of these should come as any surprise. And actually, Michael, if we could put out that first poll, right? This is across the country. And I'm curious just to know through this first poll, which of these your organization have experienced. So maybe just take a moment, and if you're able to reply to this poll so we can get a sense just in the room today what your experience has been over the past year. I can give you another couple seconds to respond if you'd like to. Yeah. So Michael, I think we can go ahead and close the poll so folks can see where we are. Yeah. So we can see from the poll that 78% of us in the room today experienced a reduction in revenue generating programming, which is not a surprise. Many of us experience reductions in private, government, or earned revenue. And this, of course, impacted our business. It impacted our way of being, and it impacted our relationship with our mission. The arts have been arts and culture have been particularly hard hit by the pandemic. This comes from, make sure I get the name of the organization right. Americans for the Arts is the organization that did this survey. And what they found is 35% of organizations have laid off staff across the country, 30% have reduced payroll, 39% have accessed reserves if they had them, and almost 2/3 increased their online presence, right? Which makes sense. We also know from the same data that 40% of arts and culture organizations across the country have closed without any concrete plans to open. The other data that comes from this survey, which I take a great deal of hope from, is that of people surveyed across the country, and they surveyed thousands and thousands of people, both in the arts and not in the arts, over 75% said that they think that the arts and culture are pivotal to having a thriving society. So hopefully that's some indicator that there will be capital available to help the sector recover. So that's where we are, right? That's the context we find ourselves in. Within that context, we are still doing the work of moving our missions forward. And I wanted to bring this back. We've looked at this, this idea of the strengths-based model of mission success in both webinars so far. And just as a brief review, our mission success depends on 4 areas of strength. One, and the one that we focus on at NFF, is the financial strength of the organization, right? Are we able to bring in enough revenue to pay for our programs and provide for the future success of our mission? But that's not all it takes, and you know this, right, to achieve our mission. We also need our data and our know-how, our unique skills. We need our relationships and reputation and partnerships in the community, and we need our people and skills, right? We need our staff. We need the unique skill set that they bring to the table. All of that together, if we keep all of that in balance, then our mission moves forward. So as we talk about financial decision making today and budgeting in the next webinar and moving forward, it's really important to remember that we cannot change any single one of these factors without impacting the other, right? If we reduce our budget because we need to, that's going to mean that our people and skills may not be as available to us. It may impact our reputation and relationships in the community. And so it's really important to keep the mission success in the center. What may seem like a really obvious financial decision at a moment may not, in fact, be in the best interest of long-term mission success. So I'd like to offer that just as a foundation for today's conversation. When we talk about the financial health of our organization, one of the things we're talking about is our business model. And our business model essentially is, how do we generate revenue? How do we spend our money, right? Are we bringing in enough revenue to not just cover our costs, right? Not just pay our team, not just cover our expenses, but ideally, and I'm saying ideally very intentionally, we want to be generating consistent surpluses so that we can build our balance sheet being our um, our balance sheet being our picture of financial health, a snapshot of time as to how we're doing, how much we own versus how much we owe at any moment, right? Do we have access to enough cash so that we can reinvest into our business model? And again, this is ideally the flow of our business. Over the past year and maybe going forward into the next year, this idea of generating consistent surpluses may not be realistic. So I want to be really clear that if this doesn't reflect where we are right now, then it's something that we can work towards in the longer term. The last element of the business model is one-time investments. When we're pivoting, when we're launching a new program, when we're opening a new facility, we may need a one-time infusion of cash that then gets integrated into the flow of our business model. The business model is the results of our annual operations, right? When our business model is healthy, overall, we're generating consistent surpluses over time. That's different than our capital structure. Our capital structure is a snapshot of overall financial health. So let's take a look at it. Capitalization really means, how are our balance sheet resources aligned with what we want to do in our organizations, with our mission goals, with the impact we want to have in our world, right? Do we have long-term the ability to invest in that mission? And the balance sheet needs are items beyond the income statement, right? Those longer term investments in the vitality and health of our organization and our mission. They're one of three situations we may find ourselves in as organizations. One is when we're undercapitalized. That means that our mission and our impact needs more capital than we have. And it may feel like we are driving a truck that's about to tip over because we don't have the horsepower to carry our mission forward. I'm mixing a lot of metaphors, but I think that you get it. The second situation we may find ourselves in is that we're miscapitalized, right? And that may happen if we have a lot of restricted funds. So we have capital, and if we look on the balance sheet looks healthy, but those funds are not allocated in such a way that it's moving our main mission forward, right? So there are situations where we may have a healthy balance sheet, but our mission isn't healthy. In that case, we are miscapitalized. And then finally, we may be well capitalized, right? We have adequate funds, and those funds are allocated in such a way that they are able to help us move our mission forward in the way that we would like to, right? Ideally, we'd all love to be well capitalized. And again, that's something that we can move towards. And a lot of the tools we'll be talking about today and in future webinars are about moving us in that direction. But for now, I'd like to offer another poll, Michael, just to see where we are as a group, and see which of these pictures feels like it most accurately represents where your organization is. Are we undercapitalized? Are we miscapitalized? Are we well capitalized? Right. And again, um, there can be a lot of shame or emotion sometimes around being undercapitalized. Um, I'd invite us just to treat it as really valuable information to have that, oh, this is where we're starting. It doesn't mean it's where we'll be next year or the year after. I'll give you all just another couple moments to respond to the poll. Great. Thanks, everybody. And I think we can close the poll just so we can get a sense of where we are. Thanks, Michael. So as we can see from those who participated in the poll, 75% of us are undercapitalized, which is certainly not surprising given where we are. And 25% of us are well capitalized, which is amazing. One of the things that's really great about knowing that there are folks in our community who are well capitalized is maybe they'd be willing to share some of their journey with others who are in a different place, right? And it's also really nice to know that there are organizations out there who have managed to stay well capitalized over the past year. A lot of times we can get stuck in a narrative that this idea of a well capitalized organization with a healthy capital structure is something that is lifted up as some sort of platonic ideal that we can never reach. And so thank you for those of you who are well capitalized. Thank you for being here and really reminding us that this is possible and that we can work towards it. For those of us who aren't as well capitalized right now, I want to take a moment just to imagine what's possible. That if we had a magic wand right now and we were able to create this well capitalized structure, in this world, paying bills and managing cash flow is simple. It's a breeze because we know we have the resources to do it. We're not worried about equipment breaking. You can make repairs and replacements. You have a plan for retiring any debt that you may have as an organization. New opportunities that come up are exciting and don't instigate a kind of inner turmoil or panic about how those new responsibilities or opportunities will be managed. And we have the ability to adapt, to move with situations as they come up. We have an internal safety net to protect us from risk that may be inherent in our revenues or programs, right? So if we lose a funder at any given moment, it's not the end of the world. Um, we can adapt in response to that. So that's if we had a magic wand. So this is what we want to move towards. I'll just share really candidly that when I was working on staff in the nonprofit world, I don't think I ever worked with an organization that had this kind of capital structure. And as a result of that, we spent I would say 60 to 70% of our mental resources really worrying about how are we going to pay bills to keep the doors open? How are we going to manage cash flows? Oh my gosh, if something as simple as a printer breaks or a copier breaks, how are we going to print things or copy things, right? It really impinged on our ability to achieve our mission because we spent all of our time attending to the capital structure. The particular organization that I'm thinking of now, and this is 10 years later, is in a really, really healthy place. And it took them half of that time, 5 years of consistent work to move into that place of being well capitalized so that the bulk of their energy could really focus on their mission and their work with the clients that they help instead of wondering how they were going to create a healthier capital environment for themselves. So to reiterate a little bit, right? When we're talking about capital structure, what we're really talking about is our organization's ability to mitigate risk, right? How can we um, how can we be resilient during those rainy days, right? And we've been in a year of rainy days. So when we think about this, one of the powerful questions we can ask are, what are our main risks right now, right? If we rely on one or two major funders to support us, our main risk might be we lose that funder, right? And that would put us in a really difficult situation. Our main risk also may be something like staff burnout. It's not always a financial risk. So I'm curious if you're comfortable putting into the chat, if you think about where your organization is right now, what is the, if you were to rank it, the number one main risk that your organization is confronting at this time? Peter, yeah, thank you. So Peter's sharing in the chat, will programs, concerts for them, revenue return to prior levels? And so I think a lot of us are feeling that uncertainty. I'm working with a major cultural organization in Los Angeles right now, and they are trying to plan without having any insight into what the next 6 to 8 months hold, right? They don't know when they'll be able to fully open. They don't know what artists will be available. So for them, the main risk is uncertainty. They just don't know what's going to happen. Thank you for sharing that. Any other risks? Funding, funding, funding. From Larry, thank you. Yeah, where's the funding going to come from? And John Moreland is sharing volunteer burnout, right? So we have three very, very different risks here, which is really speaks to the multifaceted challenges, right? Are we gonna, what's our revenue going to look like? Where's our funding going to come from? And if we're a volunteer-based organization, how do we take care of our volunteers? Um, how do we take care of them in a time when a lot of us are facing burnout? Yeah, thank you for sharing those. So that's the big picture. What are our risks? What's our capital structure? And for those of us who are undercapitalized, sometimes it's really, really important just to be able to do a pulse check. You go to the doctor and they do a checkup, they take your pulse and your blood pressure. In the same way, we can be doing the same thing for our organization on a regular basis. And these are three measures that we can use to really gauge the financial health of our organization, right? The first is simply looking at our operating surplus and deficit, which is really another way of saying, how's our business model doing? How's our business model performing? And that shows how we can cover our operating expenses with the money that we bring in, right? It reflects the strength of our business model. Is it the right business model to support our mission? And we find this information on our income statement. We can also use our audit, our IRS filing, internal statements and budgets. But our income statement is really where we find operating surplus and deficit. And the calculation is very simple. You take the operating revenue and you subtract the operating expenses, and we see where we are. Ideally, that number is positive. It may be negative, and that's really good information to have. The second indicator is months of cash, which is a measure of liquidity, literally just what is the money that we have to spend right now. That tells us how long we can cover short-term obligations and day-to-day expenses. If no other money, if that funding doesn't come in, if no other money comes in, how long can we keep the doors open is the question that months of cash helps us answer. And we find that on our balance sheet. We look at our profit and loss statement to get a gauge of our expenses. Information is also available on these other tools, our audit, our 990s, internal financials, bank statements. And this calculation is also pretty simple. It simply takes our total cash and divides it by our total expenses over 12. And this is this total expenses divided by 12 is a rough estimate. Generally speaking, we do not all spend the same amount of cash every single month. So the idea is to give us a basic idea of how many months of cash we have in the bank. The third pulse check we can use is months of available net assets. And this is a little bit more of a complicated metric, but it tells us how much of our assets are really available for use, right? We may have a balance sheet that looks really healthy, but some of those assets may have come in restricted, right? We may not have access to them until they're released by either a specific program or by time. We may have some debt that we need to pay off. And that balance sheet may also um, include property and equipment, which, you can't pay bills with a building or with with any equipment we may own. For some reason, I just thought the word tractor. So if you're a cultural organization and you have a tractor, you can't pay bills with that. Um, where we find the information for this calculation is our balance sheet, finding our expenses and our profit and loss, looking at audits, IRS filings, internal financials. And that calculation, again, the bottom is the same, our total expenses divided by 12 to get a rough monthly estimate of what our burn rate is. And then we look at our total net assets without restrictions, right? Everything we have access to right now, and we subtract our equity and our property and equipment. So this is a much more accurate read on how much availability we have of cash and assets to keep our doors open. Before we go on, I just want to point out something around this second metric, which we'll look at in more detail in a moment. But this is something that's gotten a bad rap in the funding community. In other words, sometimes funders look at this calculation and they will make a decision based on the fact that to them, our organizations may appear to have too many months of cash in the bank. I'll give a specific example of this. I worked with an organization once that, because of their business model, kept anywhere from 8 to 10 months of cash in the bank, or tried to, at any given time. And the reason they did that is that they were 100% privately funded, and they had very specific points during the year in their business model where they knew that money would be coming in. And in the times before, in between those spikes in revenue, they would essentially use those months of cash in the bank as an internal line of credit so that they wouldn't have to take loans. And then they would replenish it during the next funding spree. On the balance sheet, according to the way that some foundations were looking at financial health, it seemed like they were hoarding money, right? It seemed like they were being irresponsible stewards of the contributions that they were being given. And so as a result, they got turned down for a few grants. What we did was called those foundations and essentially told them the story. And we'll have later in this series an entire hour dedicated to how do we tell the story of our financial reality, of our business structure, of our organization. But for now, I'll just say that what we were able to do is say, hey, we have this cash for a really good reason. It's strategic and does not indicate that we have no idea what we're doing, right? And so there is no one answer to how many months of cash we should have in the bank. And one of the things that we're doing at NFF is working on the funder side as well to help them understand the idea of what it really costs to run our organizations and how absolutely essential it is that we help our organizations get to a place where they're generating consistent surpluses so they can reinvest in their mission. This is what it looks like to calculate months of cash. And in a moment, if you'd like to, I'll give you the chance to do this if you haven't already. But if we look at the balance sheet, you'll see at the top under assets, cash and cash equivalents. You take that and then you put that at your total cash. Your operating expenses, what we have on this balance sheet are, this comes from the income statement, $867,000. We divide that by 12 months to get a rough average monthly expenses, and then we simply subtract those average monthly expenses from the total cash on our balance sheet. And from that, we get our months of cash, which in the case of this example is 5.4 months, right? So that's where we get the information. I want to give you all a moment, if you haven't already, and we won't do the available net assets calculation. But if you haven't already, take a moment just to estimate on the back of the envelope kind of way your months of cash, right? If you have your balance sheet available, find your total cash and your total expenses divided by 12. And you may already know this. So, Michael, if we want to launch that third poll, and again, this is really just to get a sense of where we are as a group. Really curious to know, um, if you know, right? How many months of cash are available to you right now? We'll just take another couple moments for anyone else who would like to do this calculation and participate in the poll. Yeah. All right. Leaving it open for about 10 more seconds if anybody wants to jump in with their estimate or calculation. And let's go ahead and end the poll. Perfect. So, as a group, for those of us who participated in the poll, 57% of us have 3 to 6 months of cash available to us, and 43%, or three respondents, have 6 or more months of cash in the bank. And that's really valuable information to have. Like I said earlier, there's no one reason, no one answer to how much cash should we have in the bank, how many months of cash should we have access to. That said, this is how various levels might feel, and just see how these resonate with where you are, right? If we have less than 1 month of expenses of cash available to us, then we're in a place of really actively engaging in almost day to day cash management. Our decisions might be influenced really heavily by our access to cash. We may be putting off paying vendors, we may be delaying payroll, we might be looking for access to lines of credit. And cash flow planning, which we'll take a brief introductory look at in a moment, becomes really, really important just to know almost on a day to day basis where we are. If we have less than 3 months, cash might feel tight, right? We might have some periods of low cash. It may limit us, limit our ability to take on new programs or pursue new opportunities. And we may want access to lines of credit. In that 3 to 6 month range, we consider this as having room to breathe. And some of you, I think the majority of you who participate in the poll are in this space. We can do some longer term strategic thinking. We have funds for short term rainy days, but really we want to focus a bit on building more adaptability into our financial scenario, right? We want to be building more reserves so that we have space to accommodate more rainy days. If we have 6 or more months, we'd consider this an organization that is able to handle a decent amount of risk, right? We can withstand more financial shocks like large unanticipated facility repairs, funding cuts, possible recessions, or ongoing pandemics, things like that. It gives us the ability to think more strategically and longer term about how we are going to grow and shift and create new partnerships and pursue new opportunities in order to keep our missions moving forward. one of the most powerful tools we have, particularly if we're in a place of really needing to actively manage cash, is a cash flow projection. And again, later in this series, we'll have an entire session dedicated to this. I want to introduce it now, just as a way of showing how we might use it to manage our day-to-day decision making, right? A cash flow projection essentially gives us visibility into how and when cash is moving into and out of our organization. This is different than realizing income and expenses, because income may be realized before the cash actually is available to us, right? So when we look at this, we're looking to get a better understanding of how much risk tolerance we have. It's going to give us more certainty about when we'll have the cash to meet our operating and balance sheet needs as they come up. And there's a really important distinction between a cash flow issue and a cash issue, right? A cash flow issue is when we may have a cash crunch because money is committed but hasn't arrived yet, right? We know it's coming. We may access an internal line of credit. We may access an external line of credit. We may get a bridge loan, but this is a sense where we know our business model is working. The cash just isn't in the bank yet. That's very different than having a cash issue, which is when we realize a loss of funding that ends up giving us a shortage of cash and there's no predictable end date, right? This is a situation where our business model isn't meeting our needs, right? And so in that case, we're going to want to make decisions differently than when we have a cash flow challenge. Really, really important distinction to make. Another important distinction is our budget is not a cash flow, because our budget does not and is not designed to show the ebbs and flow of cash. Our budget's more of a roadmap. It lets us know where we're going over the course of a year and how we're performing, like how on track we are. If we look at our budgeted expenses and income versus where we are at any given time. A cash flow is more a real-time representation of where our ability to access cash is in our organization. We can do our cash flows monthly, weekly, or if our organization is in real distress, we might want to do it on a daily basis. There's a sample cash flow tool with step-by-step instructions on our website. This is the link to it, nff.org/COVID-19 tools and resources nonprofits. You'll see that on the website homepage as well if you go to nff.org. That is available for you. And again, later in the series, we'll go into great detail about how to build out a cash flow analysis tool. For now, let's look at a really basic example together. So this is what a cash flow will look like. Essentially, at the beginning, we have our beginning cash balance. And in this case, this is in thousands, so it's 120,000 versus $120, right? So our beginning cash balance goes at the top. Over the course of the month, in this example, we're getting money in from admissions and ticket sales, 40,000, a foundation grant, 110,000, and that gives us total cash receipts for the month of 150,000. Then we look at the cash that flows out of our organization, 40,000 in payroll, 90,000 in rent, giving us a total cash spent of 130,000. So our net cash, right, what we brought in versus what left, is a net positive of 20,000. We add that to the top. So we started with 120,000, we end up with 140,000, and then we carry that up into the next month, right? So we start February with $140,000 in the bank. This is a very, very basic example. And again, later in the series, we'll be looking at more nuanced examples where we will be looking specifically at how do you deal with non-operating cash that comes in, right? How do we deal with some restricted cash? So these can actually become fairly complex, but this is the basic idea of the cash flow projection. When we are working to manage our cash flow, there are essentially 4 options that we have available to us. And I'm guessing that all of you at one time or another have accessed one or more of these. The first is simply we have cash on hand, right? So for those of you who have 6 or more months of cash in the bank, this may be your situation. You have internal cash reserves built from our unrestricted operating surpluses. Our business model has allowed us to build up those internal cash reserves. We may also approach funders to ease restrictions on existing revenue. A lot of organizations have been doing it this year. And specifically in the financial storytelling workshop as part of this series, we'll be talking about really compelling ways we can approach funders and ask them to release the restrictions on the funding that they've given us. The second option we may have is simply not spending cash, right? Reducing our expenses. That might look like contacting our vendors and our lenders to negotiate favorable payment plans. It may also look like minimizing expenses. That's a very clinical sounding term, but if you think about it, and as you probably may have experienced, minimizing expenses comes at a very human cost. In other words, sometimes, a lot of times it looks like losing staff, or it looks like cutting programs back. So while on paper, minimizing expenses might look like the simplest way to make sure that our mission is maintained, it can come with impacts that are very human and have deep implications for our ability to move our missions forward. The third option we have is receiving cash. We may approach funders, whether those are institutional or individual contributors, for accelerated or advanced payments. A lot of organizations have been approaching, for example, major contributors or board members just to let them know, hey, you made a pledge to be paid over 3 years. Would it be possible to accelerate the payment on that pledge so that we can keep our doors open, so that we can maintain a thriving organization? We may be changing the timing of particular events or annual appeals. We may move an event or send out an appeal earlier than in previous years. And we may ask contributors for permission to convert their funds from something like ticket revenue to a donation. I've worked with at least 7 or 8 organizations in the past year who, right when the pandemic was about to hit, they were selling tickets for their spring benefits. And they were able to approach contributors and sponsors and ask if it would be okay, because they, obviously weren't able to do the in-person event and they didn't have enough time to pivot it to online. But most of their contributors and most of their sponsors were more than willing to have them convert those ticket sales and sponsorships just to straight contributions to support the organization. And the final option is to borrow cash, right? Drawing on an external line of credit or a bridge loan when that's appropriate. And again, it's a very, very different thing to draw on a line of credit when we are working with a cash flow challenge versus a cash challenge. With the cash flow, we know that we'll be able to pay that credit back. With a cash challenge, we may run ourselves into a problem with debt that we're not able to repay in a timely manner. So I'm curious, as we move towards the end of our time together today, just any questions or reflections? Yeah, thanks, Michael, for putting that in the chat. So again, today, what we really wanted to do is go a little bit deeper into the context of where we are right now, looking at the impact the pandemic has had, really looking at our capital structure and how that capital structure impacts our organization's futures. That idea of capital structure, by the way, and those 3 scenarios, undercapitalized, miscapitalized, well-capitalized, are really, really powerful tools that you can share and frameworks to share with a board of directors or staff or funders to really help them understand the dynamics of how the organization runs. Because a lot of times, a lot of us, when we look at a spreadsheet, that information is not really obvious to us. So our hope is that this information is valuable to you, not just personally, but also in communicating some of this, what can seem arcane financial storytelling information to folks who are in the community of your organization. And finally, we looked at a few ways to assess our organization's financial health and align decisions, right? We looked at the very basic cash flow and those three calculations to help us get a handle on how resilient our organization is at any given time. So John is asking in the chat, this is a great question. Do foundations look at the financial metrics differently? How many months of cash do they typically look for? Christine, I'll invite you to reply to this as well. But in my mind, this is, I wish I had a concrete answer for you. It 100% depends on the foundation and the sophistication of their understanding of what it takes to run a nonprofit organization. So in other words, generally the more nuanced and complete a foundation or funder's understanding is, then they probably will not have a real metric that they're looking for. In other words, they'll be more interested in, is your business model working for you and for the way that your organization is run, right? There are still some, and I can think of two off the top of my head, who immediately throw out any application from an organization that has more than 6 months of operating cash in the bank. You know, my view and NFF's view is that that is incredibly misguided. And one of the things that we can do, and this is something that I've seen many organizations do successfully, is when you're submitting your audit to a foundation, and almost all foundations ask for an audit, you can put on the front page of it a separate letter or narrative. So for example, if you have 8 months of cash in the bank, you can do a separate explanation on the PDF of your audit that explains why you have that 8 months of cash in the bank, right? Just to help the program officer, if the foundation is a little bit more strict, help the program officer advocate for you more effectively. Christine, I'm curious if you have anything to add on that.
Yes, Michael. Hi, I was just going to add, no, I fully agree. And I think even in cases where you're not submitting the audit necessarily, even I think the same goes for budget reports, right? Like, so any kind of financial document that you're submitting, there's always an opportunity to provide that narrative or that story that doesn't show up in the numbers immediately. And so a cover letter of some sort, you know, just it just helps paint the picture, you know, because I think in the absence of that kind of narrative, you know, all sorts of, you know, different assumptions, you know, can be made. And so, yeah, I fully agree. Just offer that additional piece.
Yeah. Thank you, Christine. And what I'd add to that is generally every program officer I've ever met and spoken to wants nothing more than to advocate for your organization. And so to build on what Christine was just saying, the more information we can give them allows them to be stronger advocates for us. And I'm just seeing Michael popped into the chat to add. Oh, this is really great. Thank you for adding this, the specific regional information. So just in case folks can't see it in the chat, I'll read it out loud, that seasonality is a factor. So if you're operating in the summer on the Cape and Berkshires, you might have a different structure than someone who has a year-round organization, right? The discipline we're working in makes a difference. Sharing my screen again. So that it really does depend on the business model that we're working with. Let me share my screen again with you. I had an internet blip. So as we move towards closing out, I'm really interested in any reflections that you all have, any ideas that you may be taking away from our time together today. Anything that you felt as we went along, and maybe anything that you can put into practice, right? Anything that you can do right away, and you can just put it into the chat. It's actually really helpful for us to know what's landing and what isn't. We're always iterating on these webinars and presentations. So if there's anything that really resonated with you or that you can take away, that's really helpful for us to know. And as you think about that, just to let you know what's coming up next, we're taking a week off. We'll be back on April 27th, again at 1 p.m. Eastern time. And we're really going to do a deep dive into budgeting. I know you took a look at that last week with Christine, but Robert's going to take us through a really nuanced look at how we can use our budgets, how we can structure them more effectively, and how they can become really, really powerful tools for our organizations. And then finally, to give you a chance to thank you, Peter. So in the chat, Peter shared that the advice to expand on the basic budget documents and grant applications is well taken. Yeah. And to give you a sense of the roadmap for our time together, right? We're together through June. We have 12 sessions, 9 sessions remaining. We're going to be looking at budgeting, financial planning in April, the next 2 sessions. Then on May 11th, we'll be looking in great detail at the cash flow planning, strategic budgeting and scenario planning, and moving our way through to more strategic considerations, ending up with partnerships and collaborations. And then finally, how do we put all these pieces together in telling our financial story? Thank you for these reflections. So a couple of reflections that we're seeing in the chat. I'm reading these because I'm seeing that they're just going to the panelists, which is a weird Zoom quirk where it goes, but yeah, too often, this is from Larry, thank you. Too often organizations, we don't pay attention to financial stuff until we're in trouble. So true. And that idea of being able to defer payments is really powerful. So that is the end of our time together. Thank you so, so much for spending this hour with us. And Michael, I will hand it back to you to close us out.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you for everyone for sticking around. I do want to plug one item that's coming up this Thursday. We actually are having a session on best practices in working from home, creating a space, creating balance between your professional and your private lives, how to stay connected to coworkers, but still have boundaries. So it's a little bit more on our HR side of things than this, which is kind of financial. So thank you for Cheyenne for putting some links in there. Feel free to register for that too. That's this Thursday at 2:30, I believe. Thank you again, Michael, and all the folks at NFF for your expertise. And we will see you on the very next webinar. Thank you so much.